Well, hello, listener. Thank you for joining us again on the Endless Coffee Cup podcast. And today, I'm excited. I have a returning guest, Nolan Higdon. And now you may remember Nolan. We interviewed him from his book, The Anatomy of Fake News, a couple weeks, maybe a month or two ago now. But Nolan's returned for another conversation about fake news and media. And Nolan, how are you doing? It's good to have you back.
I'm doing well. This is so great to be here. It's one of my favorite podcasts to come chat. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. So this is cool.
I appreciate that. Since the book has come out, what have you been doing, and how is the reception of the book been?
Well, I've been zooming everywhere. There was because the election day was on the horizon. There was a lot of demand for me to come give talks about how to detect fake news and what is fake news. And I got to say, in the last 4 to 6 weeks, I've been talking at least somewhere once a day, if not more. And, across the ideological spectrum, right, left, and center, people are interested in detecting fake news. So I was pretty optimistic by the response.
Oh, that is cause for optimism. That's a ray of sunshine there in an otherwise, judgmental world that people are now realizing it's a problem, and we have to solve this. That's very, very hopeful to hear. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, it's for years been kind of beating on this door, but I think something about maybe the last 4 years or so woke people up to the fact that it's not something we can keep ignoring or just kind of laughing at. It's a really serious problem, and so I've been heartened to see people's interest in changing their own news using habits.
Hmm. Well, and just the willingness to sit down and talk. I mean, that's kind of the idea behind my podcast is even having people that might think differently. There's a value in conversation and learning something that you may not know.
Yeah, there's so much you can just learn from other people, and you can also learn about your own biases. There's a great book by Malcolm Gladwell he wrote that was called "Talking to Strangers,"
Ah,
and in it he talked about how we have all these preconceived notions of people, like whether they're we're scared of them or whether we think they're harmless, and they do things that disprove that thesis. And so the way you really get to know folks is by talking and engaging with them. Not to jump right back into the election, but I thought this was one of the interesting thing about the electoral outcomes was people's perceptions of the quote unquote other side and the way they treated so many identity groups like monoliths,
mm-hmm.
proved it, really to be, off, if not totally inaccurate. And I think it's another kind of example of why we need spaces like, the Endless Coffee Cup and things like this, where you can just engage in ideas in a comfortable space.
Yeah, and that's one thing that bugs me, especially around election time, is all of a sudden it's a binary view of people that you're either left or right. And if you're right, this must be what you're about. And if you're left, this must be what you're about. And it ignores the nuance of what people go through. Now, granted, I will say there are people that, I'm a diehard Republican, always have been. I'm a diehard Democrat, always have been. There are those people. But I think for a lot, there is some agony. There is some questioning. Where will I go? Or, as we joked here at our house, is holding your nose and making a vote. There's a lot of nuance. And yet, it's always framed in binary that you voted this way, you must believe that.
I think it's a critical point. People are complicated. They're contradictory. It could be a new gas station open down the street. That's why they vote one way versus another.
Yeah.
People make decisions off random things, and there's so many just examples coming out of the early election data of like increases in like people of color voting for Trump. Last election, there was some women who voted for Trump over Hillary Clinton, and these voting patterns are just outside of our binary discussions.
Right.
And I'm not interested in justifying them or anything like that, but getting deeper to understand people. Like, why do they vote a certain way? We know, like in 2016, about 13% of Trump voters had voted for Obama previously. Like, what's that like? What goes into that decision making? To me, I'd like to engage in those conversations rather than label or dismiss these folks.
Absolutely. I mean, you're getting to the heart of nuance. You're getting to, where things become personal. And this is something that, occurred to me and just really kind of, I guess the day I came to this realization, it just struck me that, wait a minute, we're all trying to solve the same problems. For example, homelessness. No one thinks it's a good idea. And no one is advocating that we keep people on the street. It's that we all have different ideas about how to solve the problem based on your experience, based on how you grew up and those types of things. And it's not until we come together to talk about these different ideas. And yeah, we're going to disagree, but at least you heard what's driving someone else's opinion or passion about the subject.
Yeah, I think we're in a much better place if we can agree on what the problem is, but maybe disagree on the potential
Yeah.
solution. But we're in a bad place when we disagree on what the problems are. I mean, if you think half the country is the problem, I mean that's a problem in itself. We need to at least agree on what these problems are. And not to bring everything back to news media, but I think news media has gotten so lazy that it draws our attention to look what the Democrats did today or look what Trump tweeted today. We get fixated on that. We disagree about it. But those discussions are not going to address homelessness. They're not going to improve the lives of your children. They're not going to combat, climate change. They're not going to make food more readily available. They're really distractions in that sense. I think if we start to get an understanding of that, then we can have a context in which we can engage with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this tends to go along with the theme of your book, which I really enjoyed, which was it's personal responsibility. We can't rely on the government to, manage or make laws about communication or even, restrict free speech. And then also we can't expect the companies to self-regulate. It's an individual responsibility.
We live in a democracy, and we really forget how, one, radical the idea of democracy is, and then two, like how serious it is to live in a democracy. Democracy is a 24-hour a day job. That's why I sort of balked at this notion that democracy was on the ballot this year. Democracy is on the ballot. It's on our radar, or at least it should be, every single day.
Mm.
And so the whole reason we have the press is to serve our democracy. It's supposed to inform us. So the fact that we treat it like trivial entertainment or clickbait we can post online, it's really doing a disservice to democracy. And so my plea is to reassert our commitment to democracy. Don't be a media consumer, be a media user. Use this stuff to strengthen our democracy and to make the world look a little more like you'd like it to look.
That's a great point. It's interesting that, you're writing from a political perspective, but, my background is in marketing and business, and the connection and the correlation between what you write about political news media, I see it also in business news as well. That there is the clickbait about, I like to call it the new shiny object. We see it, right now, TikTok is the shiny object, and, it's getting people's attention, and marketing managers are, saying, we've got to be on TikTok. Everybody else is there. And it's just so funny to see a lot of the same parallels that happen with clickbait and sharing news and not really fully immersing yourself in it or participating in it, but rather following the headlines and making decisions based on headlines. I'm amazed at how pervasive it is in business as well as in personal and political arenas.
Yeah, I think of there's a commentator named Crystal Ball who she says that like the stock market is a graph of rich people's feelings. Um,
That's great.
they basically respond to these new things like TikTok and things like that. But that's fascinating because I've always wondered, and I know you could probably speak to this, like the opposite. Do those of us who are not in business and finance, we look at those things like market indicators and we overemphasize them or make decisions off of them that maybe we shouldn't, where those inside the industry kind of maybe like balk at those quick ups and downs from TikTok and things like that.
Not really. I'm not watching the market as much as I watch the media and how it talks about different social media platforms or different trends. A couple of years ago, it was all the millennial trend and how to talk to millennials and how to market to millennials. And, now because of Black Lives Matter and because of some of the social issues, well, now it's, well, how do we connect with Latinx? How do we connect with them? And this is the new marketing and you have to be more and it's a trend. it'll go away in another 6 months and it'll be replaced with something else. So in that way, it's like the business media is a perfect reflection of the 24-hour news cycle.
That is that is fascinating. But yeah, definitely see those trends. The banners and kind of the signaling, but then it does dissipate as the next important thing comes along.
Well, and that signaling, it's so interesting. Was reading something the other day, especially through this pandemic, about people overwhelmingly are saying, yes, we're relying on brands to make us feel better and make us feel safe. And yet the same amount of people say, I don't trust brands because they're opportunistic. And this was about the pandemic. It was about race relations. It was about social issues that we want the brands to take a stand. But at the same time, if they do, they're opportunistic. So I love the duality of what people think and the responses there.
Yeah, there does seem to be like, and you would definitely know this from a marketing perspective. I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, but to me, it does seem like perpetual signaling from both like industry and politics. Like the Democrats are really good, in my opinion, about comparatively to the Republicans, about talking about gender and race, and the Republicans increasingly are better about talking about class because Democrats ignore it. But when it comes to actual like policy or structural changes, then like everybody is silent, and I see that like from industry. Like Amazon was putting up like a Black Lives Matter banner while at the same time it was stamping out an effort at unionization by a black
Yeah,
man, getting him fired from their warehouse. So it's, I don't know, those kinds of, I guess, dualities of behavior that really, I think, feed into people's cynicism.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, well, we just saw it, I think yesterday, Gavin Newsom apologized for attending a party that was illegal under his recent proclamation there. And yeah, it's got to make the everyday person just cynical about the whole system.
Yeah, the ways in which like elites, those in power and the economic elites, whether it be Newsom or Trump or Pelosi, behave is really like in your face. At the same time, they're kind of lecturing you on values and morals and ethics. It ends up ringing hollow.
Yeah, yeah, and and that's what I get from the business side when I see brands trying to bring an ethical or moral message. And we all know you're beholden to investors, and this is geared towards sell more stuff.
Yeah, I mean that was the Nike Kaepernick ad was, I think, symbolic of that. They were appealing to young millennials and activist millennials with that ad. But again, they didn't lead to Nike changing any like internal business practices, as far as I know, or overseas practices that contribute to the same type of exploitation and manipulation that African Americans have experienced in this country since its inception.
That's a great point.
So those kinds of moments, I think, are important. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's we see a lot of that, and that was something I think someone even brought up. I was trying to think who it was, but yeah, when I think it was very early in the Black Lives Matter when Nike put out some press releases and did things and said what they were going to do, and someone wrote, "Well, Nike, if you really care about this, maybe you should pay your taxes." And and then just went in and showed how they owe billions of dollars that's offshored, that they're protecting from taxes. And if you truly wanted to invest in your community, that would be one way to do it.
Well, yeah, hit the nail on the head there. I wouldn't hold your breath though.
Exactly, exactly. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is clickbait, and especially from a news perspective. Kind of one of those things that you can identify about clickbait to help protect yourself from it.
The most effective clickbait, like all fake news, really tries to appeal to quick reactionary emotions. These can be things of like, the happiness we get from confirmation bias, the appeals to like fear and hate, like you don't know who's coming, or you're never going to guess what's about, Trump's about to do. Those types of things. And where they leave it like an open ended question, an actual headline is supposed to sum up the story in some degree so you know what you're reading about and why. If they leave it like open ended or questioning, or they appeal to reactive emotions, or where you just feel like you have to click on it to know what is in it rather than expand upon the headline, those are generally signs of clickbait. Clickbait, some of its like earliest antecedents were actually things like business practices would use. They
Hmm.
would use like sponsored content or video news releases And they would, use these in different formats. By the time of the internet, they would use them on actual news websites. So there'd be like a gray box around it and say sponsored content. But then you had supposed journalistic outlets like the Huffington Post, where they try to, make everything they did clickbait. And so they would get you to click on their supposed legitimate journalist stories. Well, the other like legacy media, they saw the internet going in this direction. They started doing it as well. And so now, even though it's all clickbait at some level, or much of it is clickbait at some level, it's hard to determine whether or not that clickbait is going to lead you to a journalistic story, or some paid ad, or some eternal clickbait like 25 pictures Matt Damon doesn't want you to see, and you have to click through each one, something like that. So, but that's kind of the state of it as of now.
Yeah, that I always tell people, yeah, if you have to click to the next page, that's a big sign that you're in the wrong place. That's that's big number one red flag right there. If you have to click to continue, or things like that, or click to go to the next page, that right there, they are totally ad funded, and that's driving the story. It's funny.
It does illustrate, though, larger economic trends, problematic economic trends in news media that, kind of going back to our conversation began about recasting ourselves as media citizens rather than media consumers. Media citizens, they use news media, but increasingly people are using it for entertainment, not democracy. And so clickbait is trying to get folks like attention drawn to content, because that desire to inform yourself doesn't exist. So this is the way they're drawing people to content.
Oh, absolutely. Taboola being one of the larger companies in the space, it just defaults to, I think, what is probably the most salacious or the most clickbaity of all clickbait headlines. And they employ, just what you said, the 10 reasons why, or pictures they don't want you to see. And again, it goes against every journalistic practice in creating a headline. It's supposed to summarize what the article is about, and then you get in and see the details. The big payoff is not in the article; it's the headline. That's the number one thing that is supposed to get your attention, and also let you know here's what the story is about.
Yeah, and you can see this with stories that go into print and like other outlets, like if they have an online magazine or if they have a traditional newspaper. Back when print was a little more accessible, but the internet was still being used, they would have different headlines for the same story if it was on the internet versus if it was in print.
Sure.
Because yeah, clickbait, it gets more eyeballs on the internet than like the traditional standard journalistic headline.
Absolutely. And so I'll give you a little bit of insight here. So I've been in my digital marketing career. I started out with search engine optimization back in the 90s. And I would say about probably 2005, 2006 is when clickbait started really getting popular in the search engine optimization community, because they knew if you could publish an article and they get people to link to it, you would rank higher in Google. And everyone was in love with this case study where someone wrote an article about, I think it was like a 12-year-old kid who stole his father's credit card, bought an Xbox, and then hired a hooker to come to his house and play games with him. And this was an article that they wrote and put out, and all of a sudden everyone's linking to it. And they were saying, look, we got all this traffic, we got all these links. Well, come to find out, I think it was a website for a car dealer. And this is what they produced in order to get better rankings in Google. And so it started this snowball effect of, let's write content with crazy headlines and we get people to link to it. And the thing was, it had nothing to do with the business. There was no business objective at all. And it took probably about 5 years for people to realize that, yeah, maybe the content of these articles should relate to the business somehow. But in some ways, I feel like the search engine optimizing community has a lot to apologize for.
I mean, well, like I concur with that, but I think that it also, speaks to something, and your story there illustrates this really well, which is that a lot of internet users have, I think, this false sense that the internet is like this boundless window into all information, and we can do whatever. But really the internet experience is very managed by the structures that were put in place. So like just the idea that if it gets clicked on more, it should be higher in the search engine. That's not a fact, or that's not necessarily the best way to deal with things, right? But it's the way that's served like search engines models. And so now people change their content as a way to do that. And as a result, we get that content in our searches. And so I think it speaks to the faux sense we have that the internet is organically giving us information. In fact, it's really managed from the side of companies, but also in fairness, also managed from our side. We like, we click, we pick our friends, we choose which websites to go to, and those kind of things as well. So we also manage it from our side as well.
Oh, highly manage it. I mean, just think about any social profile that you've created. It's some of them are, they're better than a CV. They are, you are awesome. It's only the best pictures. It's only the best accomplishments. I mean, we have incredibly managed social presence. And in the same way, everything else is managed to that. That's a great observation.
Yeah, we find we block, and the algorithms remember our choices and customize future ones accordingly. So in that way, I see the internet as much more of a managed space, and also, communication theorists have long talked about this. That we have a different like public face than we do private face, and as we increasingly are on screens more and more, whether it be like Zoom meetings, Zoom for school, social media profiles, we're getting more and more used to playing a character
Mm.
in this public sphere, and that also speaks to our interpretation of other people is really managed as well. We only get to know them in this very like public setting, which is different than how those folks may be in like a private setting, for
Oh,
example.
absolutely. One of our past podcasts, we were talking to someone who they're a coach when it comes to presentations and making pitches. And they were talking about adapting to the Zoom pitch or selling through Zoom. And, they went through the basics of how you are framed on camera, where your lighting should be, what you should wear. And it really was a managed production of how you appear on camera. And he said, how people see you and your lighting and your eye contact have everything to do with it, has everything to do with your credibility, and people will accept your sales pitch if you look good, if you look the part, if you're easy to listen to, and you're making eye contact, which means you're looking at the camera, not your screen. And throughout all of that, it was, wow, this is a curated image, but it's a necessary thing to do if you're going to do business this way.
Did you send that podcast to Jeffrey Tubin?
No.
He could have used that. See, that's
Yeah.
no, but I think all jokes aside, no, it does speak to that managed persona. We're learning how to kind of make pitches, for lack of a better word, through Zoom screens, which is fine. It's a part of interaction, and there's always been some public dimension to being social. But I think we oftentimes conflate that public persona for a private persona.
Mm, yeah, and he said one thing that I thought was very interesting, that people will make judgments based on what they see in the background. And immediately, I'm looking behind me to see, wait a minute, what do I got on the wall here? That's, but that was, all part of what creates that persona that you're broadcasting out.
Yeah, and it's kind of in addition to the persona too. I mean, we've gotten I'm guilty of this as well. That we were in the data collection age and all this. I've been a big advocate for privacy and trying to mitigate some of this surveillance that's become normalized in the war on terror era. But in the Zoom era, it really is creepy how many people look into like my home office, on like on a daily basis through Zoom. But become like awkwardly comfortable with it or like expecting it, and it's like there's a camera in the room, and I know that, and I account for it. That sort of normalization is also kind of a odd thing that's happened in this pandemic, to say the least.
Yeah, I didn't realize that until one day. I think I had a promo picture taken, and it was from my home office, and someone commented on one of the books in my bookshelf. I was like, "Oh, wait a minute. Maybe a high resolution picture wasn't the best idea." I don't know. But yeah, that's when the problem privacy thing really comes around.
Oh, heck yeah. Just that, I don't know, yeah, that idea that now the workplace is the home. I think this will be a new frontier because, right, traditionally, the home has been a safe place away from work, and that we fled, workplace to go home. And now My commute is literally just across the stairs.
Right.
And so when do I stop working? When am I off work? When am I work, Nolan? When am I home, Nolan? Those kinds of questions I think a lot of people are wrestling with in this era as well. And that speaks to the power of media. How is that going to change our relationships is a question we're going to be facing.
Absolutely. It's going to be interesting to see how this evolves over the next few months and if things ever get back to some kind of normalcy. It'll be interesting to observe.
Yeah, for sure. I think that one of the mistakes that was made was this belief that if Trump, leaves office or gets voted out, that things will go back to normal. Traditionally, and this has been a case throughout U.S. history, when things get bad or get weird or get scary, Americans try and vote for stability or normalcy or return to the past, however you want to say it. But it never happens.
Yeah.
We change, things change, and so learning how to address and deal with those changes, I think, is a better way to position ourselves rather than make America great again or go back in time or return to normalcy, which was the 1920 political slogan and things like that.
I think people just wanted the news media to stop yelling headlines every day. To me, that seemed to be the biggest reaction is like, I'm tired of hearing the screaming. I just want it to stop.
Yeah, the resistance element, and then the conservative Trump mocking of liberals every day. I'll admit it was exhausting. I turned off. I had to look at 24-hour news media for my last two books, but I basically turned it off in February. And I'd like to say it was because I was just over it, but I literally just couldn't deal with it. I was too tired,
Yeah.
having like outrage fatigue.
I think that's where most of America was. Absolutely.
Like everything was doom and gloom and end of the world.
Yeah. Well, which makes it so much harder to read into the results. I look at it as they wanted a return to media normalcy. That let's go back to the, sort of the devil we know. and and I'll be fine with that.
That's true. It's at some level. That election coverage. I tuned back into the 24-hour news networks for the election coverage, and that was like journalistic malpractice. Those people should be arrested when they cash their paychecks or stealing money. The way that they kept giving in the numbers, and they followed the numbers and the numbers and the numbers, 24 hours a day for 7, 8 days. I was like, there's a whole other world of news happening out here, and these numbers won't matter until the election is certified. So like this glue people to their screen to watch like some county we'll never visit and have their numbers come in. I think was misleading, and it's also distractionary from a lot of news that's going on in local communities, but also like major stories like our COVID cases were skyrocketing at that same time.
Yeah.
Like that to me was a much bigger story than what's going to happen in like Wayne County or something like that at that time.
Well, yeah, I noticed that as well. That hey, there's some major events going on in the world that are being ignored, and this gets to I'll bring up Postman again, where the news is the news. Rather than reporting what's happening, they're reporting on themselves, reporting something. And again, and we can even go into the polls where the polls are, the media taking a poll and then reporting on the poll. And it almost that lazy kind of let's report this rather than actually go explore something that's happening and inform people as to what's happening.
Yeah, my book "Fake News," the anatomy of fake news, was all about how fake news is a pervasive problem, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things I pointed out, and I made sure to spend a lot of time on, was that a lot of traditional news outlets and people in traditional media do produce and do perpetuate fake news. But the catch is they keep their jobs and they keep getting to act like they're experts. And I think you talked about polls. There's a prime example. Like in 2016, the polling you could argue it was wrong because they were only looking at quote unquote likely voters, and Trump turned out new voters, and perhaps that's true. But in 2020, they polled and overpolled and still got it wrong. And then you had people like candidates like Harrison in South Carolina raising millions of dollars off these polls that showed them ahead, and then they lose by double-digit points. And the news media, they thought it was their job, like you said, was to report these polls as fact. And it's mind-boggling how these folks keep their jobs. And I think that speaks to why the news is the news. I have to admit, I've had many opportunities to create ventures of basically reporting on the news. And I've always withheld because I long for the day when the news is not the news. But, unfortunately, it seems to keep becoming a bigger and bigger problem where before I can even get to the issues I care about, I have to, go through the process of disentangling the news media narratives around the problem.
Oh, absolutely. I had to ask, how many times can an expert get things wrong and still be called an expert? I don't know. Maybe we elect them. I don't know. That'll be the. It seems to me, we used to joke, you're failing up. You fail, you get promoted. And again, we heard this in 2016. We got it wrong. We got it wrong. Maybe we don't have enough empathy for people that disagree with us, or maybe we're not taking a step. Did they learn from that? I don't think so. It just seemed to get more resolute in what we're going to do, and these people don't know anything.
I think it does have to do a lot with where these media places are located. And also, the people in media tend to come from like Ivy League backgrounds, and they're in, their own bubble. And I don't mean that to disparage them, because I live in, the San Francisco Bay Area, which, my God, bubble doesn't even begin to describe what we have going on out here. But, I'm lucky enough to travel a lot of the country giving talks and gigs. And so, unless you're in a big city, it's like Trump and Pence signs everywhere. And folks just have a different focus. They have different issues they care about than in like these giant cities. And so whether or not I agree with them is irrelevant. I'm just aware of them. But when you go back to the city centers and these like liberal bubbles, they're just like, oh yeah, we're getting all these problems. We've got this big momentum. We're changing the country. And I'm like, you should really drive around outside of the bubble. It's, there's some stark differences that have not been addressed. Like,
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and that's the thing. They start arguing about things, and yeah, there's no issues. I even through the debates, I was just not really surprised. I'm like, we're not talking about any issues. This we successfully avoided any issues in these debates. That was the news.
oh yeah, like, this has been, a pet peeve of mine is that Democrats have treated demographics as destiny.
Mm,
And so basically, their argument has been, use favorable rhetoric toward demographic groups that are expanding in size. And those people will turn out to vote for you because you're not the other guy and because you're using favorable rhetoric. And we don't have to get into policy, because once we start getting into policy, we turn off potential voters. They're always chasing that Republican unicorn voter in the middle.
yeah.
Interestingly, in this election, you saw a lot of that demographics or destiny start to break down, and that again, people are complex. Some are swayed by issues, some are swayed by behaviors and attitudes. It's much more complex. And so I do hope that part of the transition from the post-Trump era is not only a recognition of the shortcomings of Trump's rhetoric and behavior, but also the shortcomings of the Democratic Party and neoliberal ideology that made people take a gamble on Trump in the first place. And I think a dedication to policy is a step in that direction. And again, some of the data shows that basically if you were for universal health care, regardless of whether or not you were progressive or conservative, you won in this election.
Mm.
And I think it speaks to how policy initiatives drive out votes. Legalizing marijuana drives out votes, but catchy phrases, appeals to demographics aren't necessarily that successful.
If you are a regular listener of Endless Coffee Cup, well, you know I love coffee. If you are listening for the first time, then the name of the podcast should be a big clue. I love conversation, and I think that we have a lot to learn from each other if we only take the time to sit and talk over a cup of coffee. Maybe we'll come to a resolution, maybe not, but at least we've learned from each other. It's in this spirit that I'm happy to announce a regular sponsor of the Endless Coffee Cup, a coffee sponsor. In Care of Coffee is a coffee company that is unique in the market. They are directly tied to the communities that produce coffee and ensure that the proceeds go to the coffee farmers, the local producers, and their communities. There are no middlemen or markups. The proceeds from the sales go directly to the communities that work so hard to bring us the enjoyment of a great cup of coffee. Go to incareofcoffee.com, follow the link in the notes, and use the code ENDLESS to get 10% off your order. Again, that's the discount code ENDLESS to get 10% off your order. I'm enjoying the whole bean Wewe Tenango coffee today. Please support our sponsor and know that your support goes directly to the farmers, producers, and communities that help power us here at the Endless Coffee Cup Podcast. Yeah, that was interesting. Out of the state ballot issues were definite trends as to where the country is going, and it really doesn't fit the narrative of either a Democrat or a Republican. It really is almost a conflicting view of what we've been told people are like. And so I was really fascinated by the different ballot issues around the country and the marijuana laws and things like that. Very, very interesting to see.
I have to say, I'm embarrassed for my state here of California with the Prop 22 initiative, which, if for listeners who don't know, basically independent contractors like Uber and Lyft and things like that were reclassified as employees, so they would get more benefits and workplace rights by the state, and voters had a chance to switch them back to independent contractors. And Uber and Silicon Valley were behind this transition, as was the Democratic Party as well. But the interesting part was the messaging.
Mm,
They message it as, being an independent contractor allows like entrepreneurship and some sort of like autonomy in the workplace, primarily for people of color. And that's who were in a lot of the commercials. But it ignored like economic realities or God forbid I say it, like class issues that, a lot of these folks, why are you working a second job? Like, not why do you choose to, like, why do you have to work a second job? What is it about our economic system that forces folks to do this while driving down the value of their vehicle and things like that? And so I thought it spoke to in a state in California, we can't blame Republicans because we're a Democrat state, like top to bottom. And I thought it kind of spoke to the way that they're so focused on kind of demographic messaging, that like economic realities are like an afterthought. And unfortunately, a lot of those Uber drivers who are disproportionately people of color are on the losing end of that gamble.
mm. Wow. That's interesting. Yeah, it's almost like you can't play the same demographic games. It kind of goes back to what we were saying before. It's not binary. There's a lot of nuance, and unless you understand what that nuance is, you're going to miss the boat.
I think you see when they treat like communities of color like monoliths, like the Latinx vote, right? Like if Latinx only in this political discourse and media, Latinx voters only care about immigration, and Democrats want all folks to immigrate, and Republicans want nobody. So it's obvious they're going to vote Democrat. But then you look at the numbers, and it's like, first of all, within Latinx voters, they care about a multitude of issues. And it's totally different in Texas compared to Florida, compared to wealthy, compared to poor, compared to Cuban, compared to Central and South America. And then you saw some folks actually vote for, Trump and increase the Trump's Latinx turnout despite his rhetoric against Latinx immigrants. And so again, we said it speaks to, we have to get out of this space where we feel comfortable talking about folks like monoliths and realize that we do have national elections and we pay attention to national elections, but what works in one area does not work in necessarily another area. And that takes like
Mm.
nuanced thinking. Like maybe Latinx voters in California care about X, and maybe Latinx voters in Texas, disregard X for Y. And we got to start thinking, I think, in that way if we ever want to really understand our country and our democracy.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, people may vote one way because a gas station went in down the street. It has everything to do with what my life is like right here, right now, in this moment, in this place. That's what's going to affect me more than what's going on nationally or anything like that.
Yeah, politicians used to know this. This is the odd thing about Democrats and Republicans for like the last 30 or 40 years. They've really forgotten how to like kind of speak to people's realities. Instead, they just kind of make promises about what tomorrow is going to be. And then I think they've lost that kind of connection. And you see, it's at some level, I guess it's kind of funny watching these people struggle. Like, Trump, the rapacious capitalist, pretends like he cares about like, the working class. And Obama, remember he like tried to go bowling and it was like a setback for bowling. And George W. Bush was trying to be a cowboy, even though he was like a rich Connecticut kid, right, and all that. So they're kind of funny in that sense, but it comes off like just so fake to people. But it speaks to how I think the distance between the ruling class and the actual people, that they can't even find like commonalities anymore.
Mm, wow. Well, I mean, it's strangely related. I did want to talk to you a little bit about this. And, you know, one of the things about rhetoric that I absolutely love are the logical fallacies. And especially in politics, we see a use of the fallacy of the straw man. And I love it because and I think Obama was particularly very good at this when he would say, some would say that no one should have health care. And I'm like, wait, who said that? Where's that come from? And then, and that's the straw man. You prop up your opponent's argument to such an extreme case that no one in their right mind would say, well, yeah, that's a good idea. And then you knock it down. That's why it's called the straw man. But what has really impressed me, or impressed itself upon me, I would say, over the past 4 years, do straw men exist anymore? Because I would see things online, and maybe this was part of the fake news or, Russian interference. I would see people post things, and I would say that is probably the most extreme case I would ever imagine. And someone is posting it with no irony whatsoever. And I felt like we've lost the straw man. There's no such thing anymore.
It's so true. I mean, yes, like you said, a straw man, right? It occurs when you take another, person's or side's argument and you distort or exaggerate it, right? And like the reason why people usually commit straw man is because it appeals to audiences. It's like I would like to, I'm going to choose to argue against the argument I wish you made rather than the one you did make.
Right. Yes.
In that sense. So, but I think that the fallout from that in a messaging perspective is we have a straw man perspective of people we disagree with, and the news media is recycles these because they play these clips of straw man arguments, but they don't break them down factually. So like
Mm.
when Donald Trump is saying that like Biden's going to sell America to China and that Biden's a socialist, I laugh, right? Because I'm in California, we'll teach you what socialism is, but the a lot of voters, they buy it, and you drive around like again the country, and you see like no socialism here, and they're talking about Biden and Harris, or we're going to protect America from China, no Biden Harris, and you recognize how powerful those straw man sort of arguments are after the election, just to be fair and kind of point to both sides. Mike Pompeo made that comment about how he expects a fair transition after the election. And he said, we're going to make a transition into the second Trump administration. And then he followed it. Right. Okay. You laughed. Everybody gets this was a joke. And he followed it up and said, of course, no matter what happens, all jokes aside, whatever the electoral outcome is, we'll make sure it's a fair and safe transition. If you look in lefty circles right now, like John Oliver and all these shows, they're talking
Right.
about how he said we're going to a second Trump administration. It's like that's not what he meant. To clear, there's a context here. You're making a straw man argument, but now there's this fear that like Pompeo is leading the resistance to the Biden election, which at least that comment is not evidence to support it.
No, yeah, it was half of what he said, and I've been so interested to see that spun around, and yeah, and it turns into clickbait headlines, and it's just crazy to see that. But what fascinates me about the straw man is that actually, like you said, I'm going to argue what I wish you asked, but at the same time, if I were to use the straw man against you, it now forces you to respond to it, and to respond to a baseless misrepresentation of your view. And so rather than disputing, now you have to defend. And it really puts a lot of now the attention is on the statement, however outrageous or incorrect. It's now you've got to defend it. And that's what I think is so unfair about it. But that has become really the basis of policy debate, of left versus right. It's just been a fascinating watch to see how it's used.
Yeah, it's a weird space because like most people, myself really included, you aren't trained at a young age on how to respond to absurdity. It's not something we train people to like expect, right? In that sense. So how do you respond to absurdity? Well, traditionally, what politicians used to do in the pre-internet days, you ignored ridiculous claims because if you gave them any attention, then you drew more attention to them. Like you said, now you're end up defending something you never said. But however, in the internet age, I mean, it's been a different game. Now they take these straw man arguments, they post them everywhere, they report them everywhere, they comment on them everywhere, and you not commenting is treated like you're somehow hiding and afraid of what you said, or embarrassed by what you said or did, or whatever like that. Whatever it is. So it forces people to come out and respond. And again, as you mentioned, once they respond, then they're in a space where they're defending something they didn't say, and then the argument becomes about what the argument was rather than like what they were trying to achieve in the first place.
Yeah. And it's gotten to the point now where it is so extreme. And what used to be a straw man, I feel like now it's like, is there actually people that believe that? And maybe I'm falling for the clickbait, but I see things. I'm like, wait, that's the most extreme position you could take. How is that a good idea?
That the straw man arguments are commonplace, and they're shaping our politics. And again, we're laughing at them at some level, but they are really powerful. Like a lot of the straw man claims that came out after the election about supposedly it was stolen, and that the Biden camp was going to claim they were going to do whatever it took, which is not what they said. But these arguments resonate. A lot of people are questioning, was the election legitimate, even though there's really no evidence to discredit the election.
Hmm.
And I think that's the power of those straw man arguments is you have otherwise rational people believing irrational things. And one of the things I point out in a lot of my work is that the reason why false content or straw man arguments are so dangerous is not because they're wrong or disprovable and people believe them. It's because they get people to do things they think come from a place of moral righteousness, but actually turn out to be hugely problematic. So, if the election was stolen and you stood up to defend democracy, that doesn't make you a bad person. That makes you a good person. You should always defend democracy. But false content and straw man arguments about the election get good people to go out and discredit seemingly accurate elections. And so that kind of transition, I think, is important to recognize, is that rather than make fun of people who fall for these arguments or act upon them, we should recognize that their reaction comes from a place of good in a lot of cases. And,
Yeah.
and so how do we laud that while simultaneously recognizing the problem with like news literacy skills or recognizing fallacious arguments?
Hmm. It comes back to kind of what we talked about earlier is everyone wants free, accessible, and fair elections. And I kind of will then I'll add a comma. Don't we? That is what we want, right? And like you said, we have to agree on this first.
Yeah, like you have to. I mean, this is the ripping my hair out thing about democracy. And I think your question gets to this, is that I have never ever in my life counted ballots. I would wager that you never have either. My entire life, I generally have accepted the results of electoral outcomes, and I've been angry on election night for most of my life. But I accept it, and that's because democracy is predicated on us having faith in the process. And there's a lot to say to critique the process, but if people, not even a majority, just enough, don't have faith in the process, then you don't have a democracy. So this whole debate and fake news and straw man arguments and things like this, these are really, really dangerous. And I think we need to reassert that idea that, look, the reason why we engage in news and conversation and discussion and we have ballot counters and we have mail-in ballots is because we want the most accurate results we can, trust in. It's not because we want to quote unquote win or destroy the other side.
That is a great, great point. And again, yes, it comes back to, we're agreeing on the same things, and we have to have that. Let's identify the problem first, and if we can agree what the problem is, then we can create a better narrative for us to work together and solve that problem.
Yeah, and I think you could take two groups who normally are not put together, but they're the majority of the public. Like a lot of Trump voters who were polled, although now I'm citing polls, which might be problematic, but a lot of Trump, they show general disdain for the system, and they believe elites in Washington don't address their needs. There was also a Knight Foundation study that said there's 100 million people who are disproportionately people of color who don't vote because they don't believe either party addresses their needs.
Yeah.
Regardless of all the differences, we're talking somewhere between like 125 to 150 million people who share that same sentiment. They see the same problem. Imagine if you could
Hmm.
have someone speaking to how do we address that problem together. That's a huge chunk of the country. It's like 50% of the country.
You could get another party or two out of that, which might not be a bad thing. But yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated, yes, at how many people don't participate in the process. This was a situation, I think this was when Obama was running against Hillary in the primaries. And my wife and I went to France. I was speaking at a conference there, and in a typical French fashion, they split us up to different tables. So my wife was left to fend for herself at a table, and I'm at another table. And the entire conversation was about, who are you voting for, Obama or Hillary? And my wife is just sort of in this, well, I don't know. It's who, and she laughs. To me afterwards, she goes, "They assume I'm voting for either." It's just this. But then one lady asked her, and it was a very interesting question. She asked her, she goes, "Do you believe that you can change things? Do you believe your vote will make a difference?" And my wife thought for a second. She goes, "Yes, I do believe it will." And the lady responded by saying, "That's the difference between you Americans and us." She goes, "We have no faith. There's nothing I can do that will change anything." And it was such a realization for her. And we're talking about that I think that number one is an American thing, that, the stress on the individual. But yet also at the same time, I think we have also lost that with a number of people that believe that no matter what I do, my voice won't be heard. I'm not going to change anything. And I think is probably one of the larger failures, that as a country, there's people that have been left behind, that don't feel that anyone speaks for them. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, and I think and that's a great point to emphasize shortly, is because we're on the heels of this election, and for folks to remember moving forward, which is there's all these different elements of democracy, which are like we talked about in this talk today. We talked about propositions, we talk about elections. There's presidential elections, local elections, state elections. Those are all part of the process. So is reading news and informing yourself, which we talked about. But another element that we all often all gloss over because it makes us feel somewhat uncomfortable at times is democracy is a full time job that requires activism, organization, and agitation. And so people ask me, does voting work? And my answer is, well, it depends. If you go to vote for the guy you want to have a beer with and then you go home for 4 years, then no, it's not really going to work. But if you vote in someone who you try and, organize, agitate, protest, push, annoy to get to do, X, Y, or Z, then democracy works and then your voting works. And
Mm.
this is bared out by the, examples historically. I always like to point out that these presidents who come into office on, totally different agendas end up doing like progressive legislation because they're forced to. So like Woodrow Wilson never really talked about women voting in this country, but he was trying to sell democracy to the world, and women protests in the White House to embarrass him, saying like, "How can you deliver democracy to the world if you can't deliver it here in D.C.?" So he was like, "Get them the right to vote and get them off my lawn so I can do my foreign policy." And
Great.
any better
Yeah.
example is Dwight Eisenhower, right? Eisenhower probably did the most civil rights of a president in the 20th century, not because he was Mr. like woke military man, but because the protesters on the ground were destabilizing the country, and they were giving the Soviets propaganda to use against American way of life, by highlighting its racism. And so Eisenhower was just like, this needs to stop. We need to get this off TV because I'm trying to get all these post-colonial countries underneath like the Western sphere, and this is not helping.
Mm.
And so it's putting that kind of pressure on leaders rather than having them be a friend or a hero. Recognizing them as an employee, you need to constantly pressure. That's how democracy works.
Great. That is a great example. Wow. Yeah, they are an employee, and I think we forget that.
Yeah, and it's difficult to fire them, so it's important that you go through a good hiring process.
Absolutely. Well, I wasn't satisfied with the hiring process. I wasn't satisfied with the vetting process. I wasn't. I want another round of candidates. That's what.
We're going to close the search committee. Yes.
Yeah. Nolan, hey, this has been a wonderful hour, and I always look forward to talking with you and getting your input. So, man, thank you so much for spending some time with us here.
This is always a pleasure, and I'll come back anytime. Keep up the great work, and hopefully your listeners keep tuning in. Thanks.
Well, Nolan, I want to have you back because, as you said, you do a lot of work in privacy, and especially my side with the business and media, and you're on the media side too. I think we should absolutely have another conversation about privacy, and I think we could probably fill a couple of hours on that.
It's a date. I'm in.
All right. Listener, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Endless Coffee Cup. And you can find Nolan's information on the show notes on the page. So, Nolan, thank you again. Listeners, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time on the Endless Coffee Cup.